Lord Mayor, Members of Parliament, distinguished guests, good evening. Thanks for dragging yourself away from the US presidential election and escaping from the rain. And welcome to the Free Community Forum, to lease or not to lease the port. I'm Nick McLaren. Now, before we start tonight's proceedings, I'd like to welcome the Chairman of the Illawarra Aboriginal Lands Council, Roy Dooch Kennedy, with a welcome to country.
Yolanga Mirial, Tianya no Nuru, Tianya no Garu, Yolanga Agulia. Welcome to All Father Creator. I see my land, I see my water. Welcome to Mother Earth. Yolanga, Yolanga, Yolanga. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. First and foremost, I'd like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of this land, Dharawal land. Those peoples are the Wadi Wadi peoples. I mean the Wadi Wadi language group and the Laori people. So there's a lot of confusion over who we are. We have been custodians of the land since the dreaming, what we know as the Narrabeen or the Altaringa. That refers to the past, the present and the future. I'd also like to pay my respect to my elders, past and present, and to those of the future, for they will carry forward the memories, the dreams and aspirations of Koori peoples. Koori peoples are who we are. Aborigines is a foreign word that relates to the people in New South Wales and Victoria. We must always remember that under the concrete and the asphalt, this land is and always will be Koori land. And in time, and this is my challenge to all of you, equality, social and economic justice will be a reality for the first peoples of this land. And that is a conversation that we will be having in the future. So with that, Yolanga, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dooch. Now I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our special guests up on the stage here. Minister for the Illawarra and Minister for Finance, Greg Pearce, South Coast Labor Council Secretary, Arthur Rorris, Ward 2 City Councillor, Michelle Blitzavs, and local economist and Director of Strategic Economics Group, Graham Larkham. I'd also like to acknowledge 4 speakers that we'll be hearing from later, sitting down the front here. Opposition Spokesman on Ports and Energy, Ron Honig. New South Wales Greens MLC, Dr. John Kay. The Member for Kira, Ryan Park. CEO of the Port Kembla Ports Corporation, Don Figliamini, and Illawarra Business Chamber President, Mike Leask. And I'd also like to acknowledge a few others, the Lord Mayor of Wollongong, Gordon Bradbury, the Member for Wollongong, Noreen Hay, I see is here tonight, and also a large number of Wollongong and Shell Harbour councillors are here tonight, so I'd like to acknowledge all of them. And now, our first speaker for tonight to get you warmed up for the debate is the Lord Mayor of Wollongong, Gordon Bradbury.
I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, of their elders past and present, on which we gather for this meeting tonight. It was the resolution of Council to convene this forum, an opportunity to hear from the leaders of the New South Wales Government why it is that the port of Port Kembla would be sold or leased. This is the opportunity, and I would ask that everyone utilises this opportunity with dignity and respect and to listen accordingly, so that we might be better informed and make appropriate decisions for the betterment and the future of our community. As Lord Mayor, I welcome those who have travelled distances to be here, especially Minister Pearce. I'd also like to acknowledge the member for Wollongong, Noreen Hay, the member for Shellharbour as well, Anna Watson, and Ryan Park, who also is the member for Kira. I would also like to acknowledge others who have travelled distances to be here, and we'll hear from them later on this evening. So welcome to our city, and welcome to the Illawarra, and in some respects, I invite you to utilise this opportunity for the betterment of our community, the future of the Illawarra, and to make sure that we leave this place better informed in terms of the decisions and the aspirations of our people. Many have contributed to the port over the years through their determination, skill, planning, and also their effort. It's important that we enjoy the benefits of the port, and it is about the port that we gather this night, not other agendas, but the opportunity to be better informed and as a result make better decisions. Welcome, and may this forum be an opportunity where we leave this place, as I said, better informed and ready to go forward to make this part of the world an even better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'm going to go through a few rules of engagement. This is just how it's going to work. Each of our panellists up here is going to talk for 5 minutes, and there'll be a little beeper, hopefully, that goes off at the end of the 5 minutes, and I'll be reminding them if they go over time. And after that, we'll take questions from the floor for approximately 30 minutes. And to read out your question, you have to first submit it in writing. You should have done that, well, you could have done that at the beginning before you came in, but there's still time to do it now. There's a desk over on the side, and you can go over there, and if your question suddenly jumps into your mind, you can run over and write it down, and then I will select people, and then they can stand up and nominate what question they want to ask. We're also recording the night on video. There's going to be a recording of this available for the people who couldn't make it along tonight. If you don't want to be recorded, I suggest you don't ask a question, because if you get up and ask a question, you might be recorded. I just want to also quickly do a little brief summary of key events, just a few dates to throw at you just to get us started. December 14, 2011, the Treasurer Mike Baird announces Morgan Stanley will act as the state's financial advisor for the long-term lease of Port Botany. June 12, 2012, the budget is handed down, and the Treasurer Mike Baird includes plans to lease Port Kembla and Port Botany on a 99-year lease, with money set aside from that for the Illawarra. July 25, Cabinet signs off on a recommendation to lease the port for 99 years. September 7, the port privatisation plan is debated in the lower house of Parliament. October 2, Mike Baird, the Treasurer Mike Baird, launches the formal transaction process, calling for expressions of interest to lease the ports. And then the next date is November 13, where the legislation will be debated in the upper house, where the government relies on cross-bench support to pass legislation. So that's where we're at. Our first speaker is going to be the Minister for the Illawarra and Finance Minister Greg Pearce, so please welcome him to the stage.
Thanks, Nick. Roy, is there any reason we can't have a bit of light in the room? It's a forum rather than a show. That's great, that's great. Thanks very much. Parliamentary colleagues, Lord Mayor and councillors, other dignitaries, panellists, but most importantly, all of you who've come out to participate in this forum tonight. I congratulate the Council on the initiative. We feel that it's very important that we have these discussions with communities when we have to make difficult decisions. And so I'm very grateful that all of you have given some time to come along tonight. Now, Nick, I may go a minute or so over because the rules for this forum have changed sort of on a daily basis, and I prepared on Friday's rules, not today's. The government is committed to the Illawarra, and we are committed to the port as a major driver of economic activity in the area. And we're committed to the area. You only need to look at the budget, where we included funding for a new railway station at Flinders, upgrades and car parks for stations at Kiama and Gerringong and Albion Park, new carriages, new buses, upgrade of Picton Road, the Gerringong Princess Highway upgrade, improvements to Wollongong Hospital, which you know about, new housing for people with disabilities, the West Stapto housing release, where we're accelerating provision of water and sewerage infrastructure, the sewerage programs in Robertson and Kangaroo Valley, investments in tourism, major events like the Grand Fondo. We are committed to the region. We are spending money in the region. We're ensuring activity in the region. But you also know that all governments are facing financial difficulties. And in New South Wales, whatever you think the detail is, we all know that revenues are down and that we have a major infrastructure backlog. And for us to continue to fund the delivery of new infrastructure and the delivery of services that are required, we have to look at different ways of raising revenue. And so one of the things we're doing is looking at the provision of services through the private sector, where the private sector is well placed to do that. And it's a tried and true route. It's tried and true around the world. And it happens around the world because governments around the world and communities around the world have had to accept that that governments can't do everything, and that where the private sector can equally or even more efficiently do things, then it's a good idea to do that. And so we're looking at the tried and true path followed by Australian governments before. The same path that was followed with the airports, the same path that we've already followed with the desalination plant, and the same path that was followed by the last Labor government in Brisbane with its port up there. So why do we look at doing these things? Well, first of all, when you have a government asset like Port Kembla, a long-term lease of the asset is a way of bringing forward an upfront cash payment. And in the case of Port Kembla, we're talking about around $500 million coming into our coffers next year, which would not otherwise be available. So, bringing forward that money. The second reason is that when you bring the private sector into running an asset like the port, you avoid the need to pay for the growth of the port, or the asset. So in the case of Port Kembla, we know that the outer harbour development is crucial to its future growth. And we know that that's a project worth about $700 million. But did you know that the previous government did not put aside a cent to do that? And so we are looking at trying to avoid that by getting the private sector to provide that extra $700 million, which otherwise we would have to find through our normal revenues. And, when we look at doing this with an asset like the port, we retain ownership. It's a 99-year lease. The government and the people retain ownership of the property. But we bring in a new operator to operate some parts of it. Some parts of it we will retain. For example, the maritime services, the rescue services, the safety services will remain with the Ports Corporation, which will continue to exist. In doing this transaction, as with transactions in the past, there's again a tried and true approach to ensure that it's fairly done and that, for example, employees are looked after. Just another. No, two will do. That employees are protected. And in the process for this sale, we're following the same process has occurred in other sales and leases, which is a guarantee of employment for those who want to stay, or a payment if employees want to move to the new operator. And we also remove risk from the state. Many of you know really well the effects of the BlueScope steel decisions. But what you probably haven't thought about is that BlueScope reduced overnight 50% of its usage of the port. That's a major risk in running that business. So they're the reasons we're looking at doing this. But can I just remind you of one other thing? The port is already overwhelmingly privately run. Almost every job there is actually run through private companies. The coal companies, the grain companies, the car companies. They are already running the Port Kembla. So what we want is upfront new money plus the multiplier effect of bringing forward investment. And in the case of this transaction, we've done what normally does not occur, and that is we have been able to reserve $100 million of extra money for the Illawarra out of the proceeds, an extra $100 million. And I invite you to think of some of the projects that we can talk as a community about using that $100 million on next year. So that's the key. We bring forward funds, we avoid future capital, we continue to own the asset in the long run, we look after employees, and we have, in this case, an extra $100 million for the Illawarra. So thanks, Nick, and I'll be happy to participate in the questions later.
Thank you. A couple of interesting key points there. The port. Time's up. Yeah. Very good. The port is overwhelmingly privately run already. We've just heard. $100 million will be put aside for the Illawarra, infrastructure in the Illawarra, and the port will remain in public ownership. So that's just 3 points that I picked out of that. Our next speaker is the Secretary of the South Coast Labor Council, Arthur Rorris.
Well, thanks for that, Nick, and I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we meet and their elders past and present. I was just checking what the beeps actually meant. One at 3 and one at 5, is that right? Okay. 5 minutes. You've got 5 minutes. Okay, all right. Well, we'll get straight into it. I too also would like to acknowledge the Minister, parliamentary colleagues, councillors, Lord Mayor and others. The difficulty is going to be keeping this to 5 minutes, but I don't think I've got much of a choice here, so I'll be speaking a lot faster than I'm used to. Like many of you, when I look at Port Kembla, I think of not just an asset in an economic sense. I think of something that is integral, that is key to this place, of its character. Its value is measured more than in just dollars and cents. I wanted to say that at the outset, because I know many of you know that, and some of your questions might in fact reflect that. But I wanted to outline that at the start, because most of my speech will actually be dealing with the economics of this. In terms of the economics, because it is such a special place, and because of the dark clouds economically that have hung over this region for a long time, it makes it even more important that if governments consider alienating the asset, as I say, and I know we have a difference of opinion here, but 99 years for most economists is as good as a sale. But let's not quibble about the terminology. To take that away for the 99 years and everything that comes with it, it's incumbent on the governments to make the case. And we have heard some of that case here tonight from the Minister. These are some issues that have come up in this community, which I think are compelling. The first is this: the reason stated for the sale in the first place is the position of the budget. There hasn't been any suggestion that I'm aware of about the efficiency of the port, the management of the port, or in fact the profit levels, the revenues from that port. Let's be clear about that. If the question is about budgetary pressures on the one hand and the need to invest in infrastructure, let's look at two things. The first is the opinion of the Auditor General only very recently about some massive mistakes in the previous budget's forward projections that say $1 billion, not 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 million, but $1 billion out. And in fact, the state's finances are in the black. So in one stroke, the rationale about being in the red and having that pressure on budget, I think, has been quite clearly and authoritatively dismissed. The second question is this, and that is one that has been bugging, I know, many of you. If you have an asset, let's say for argument's sake, is worth 500 million, if you've got such an asset and you're asking the private sector to consider investing that, to buying that or to leasing that for 500 million, you're asking a private sector organisation, body, whether they're local, multinational, whatever they are, to invest $500 million, to borrow essentially $500 million to invest and make profits on that. And yet you have that asset in your hands, making you that revenue without having to invest, without having to borrow that $500 million. If we are to operate this state in a business-like fashion and to use the principles of the business sector as the most efficient ones, how is it that we can expect the business sector to borrow 500 million, invest in this and reap the profits, whilst all we have to do is manage it correctly as it has been done and keep receiving those dividends for the people of New South Wales? Fundamental question. But there are others. If it is also a question about the things that drive the private sector being good, in other words, things like competition, well, let's be clear, this is a natural monopoly. It's not as if we've got 2 or 3 ports to choose from in the region. They're not going to go to Corrimal or Bellambi or to Thurrool. It's Port Kembla and Port Kembla only. The competition is the 3-port competition, Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. Hence arises some other problems. How is it that you can have Newcastle stay in public hands and Sydney and Port Kembla go into private hands? Will the argument then be a productivity commission report to see if we can flog off Newcastle too? I would put money on that. I would think that would be the next thing on the agenda. But even if that wasn't an issue, how is it that we could argue convincingly that that is in the best interest of the people of this region and the state when we know that it's a profitable enterprise? We can quibble about the figures, whether it's 20, 30, 40 or 50 million. One thing is clear, that things like the taxation equivalent does go back to the government. The other... Would you like 2 more minutes? Yes, please. The other thing that is clear is that the revenues that do come in are likely to expand massively as the constraints on Sydney bite. We will get containers in the Illawarra. They will come. And when that happens, it won't be a $50 million profit. It will be much, much more. But if we let it go, it'll be in private hands, and that won't be enjoyed by others. A couple of other things just very quickly. If we are to accept that the reason is budgetary pressure and investment in infrastructure, we have to ask where that pressure comes from. And it comes from something called a credit rating, a AAA credit rating. We need to ask ourselves, who sets that? And the people that set that are usually your Wall Street cowboys like Standard & Poor's and Moody's. They're the same crowd that got pulled up by the courts just recently for giving ABN AMRO a AAA credit rating and taking many of the councils for a ride over their investments. So here's a mob based overseas in New York or wherever they are, telling these governments how to run their finances, that it's okay for the private sector to borrow 500 million, but it's not okay for the people of this state and this city to keep something that they have. That is the real question here. And whilst we're on that issue, it's actually been quantified. What happens if you lose a AAA credit rating? 15 to 20 marginal basis points, as they say, 0.15 to 0.2, quantified at $20 or $30 million. So we are selling off the assets of this region and the state. We are slashing billions from health and education and all of the other services to satisfy these corporate cowboys, and all for what? 20 million, even if they pull the plug on the AAA credit rating. To cut a long story short, because I know we've got Warwick coming up afterwards as well on this, I liken it this way, that if you know that you've got those storm clouds and you want a shelter, why sell your house? Thank you.
And I must say that was exceptionally well timed. Now, a couple of key points there. How can we trust the New South Wales government to manage the asset of the port? Where will privatisation stop? And the concern about having overseas financiers making major decisions about how we run and operate infrastructure. So thank you, Mr. Morris. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Councillor Michelle Blitzas, Ward 2 Councillor with Wollongong City Council.
I'm little. Well, thank you very much to my fellow councillors for the invitation to speak tonight on this important topic. And it's a privilege actually to be on the program. As a member of the Wollongong Economic Development Board, I recognise the importance of the role the port plays in the city's future. But this issue's been hotly debated at a number of our council meetings, and one I think made the press and closed us down, first time ever. That was very exciting. But I believe one of the strengths that our council has is to recognise and consider differing viewpoints. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be here to share my view. But I'm pleased that tonight's event actually does achieve one of the motions of council, so we are actually achieving some things, which is nice. Could I also convey my thanks to all the participating speakers, and in particular Minister Pearce for taking time to attend and to answer many of our questions this evening. As Minister for the Illawarra, but also as Minister for Finance and Services, he has great insight into not just our region, but an understanding of the issues across the state. We appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate how the Illawarra can support the economic growth of New South Wales. But one thing is very clear, we're all very passionate about our port and recognise the impact that it has on our economy. We've seen much growth and Dom's leadership has led the port to do some great things. We're all very excited about the Outer Harbour expansion and the opportunities that that will bring. We see an exciting future around the port precinct with the positive impact flowing onto the surrounding suburbs of Wollongong. But we must be careful to think beyond the emotion of this issue and consider the facts. We continue to face high unemployment levels. Our economy has moved from being a steel-driven city to one where small business now generates more than 80% of the Illawarra's income, with an emerging knowledge and ICT sector. The Port Corporation could be considered to be one of these small businesses, with just over 50 employees. We need to be considering opportunities for economic investment in our city, investment that will create jobs. Whilst the government can support that, I hope we will see more state government offices being moved to Wollongong, perhaps. That would be a great support, Minister. Throw that in there. It's rarely government that creates those jobs. Private industry and business creates jobs, and they create it best through innovation, and Wollongong is the city of innovation. As a councillor, one of the things that's become clear to me is that infrastructure is a huge drain on the budget. Councils all over New South Wales of Australia are struggling to keep up with the renewal of footpaths, roads and bridges. I can only imagine the difficulties involved in keeping the much larger, more expensive and increasingly complex state infrastructure renewed. Here in the Illawarra, we have a particular and strong interest in rail infrastructure needs. No one here will need reminding that each day we see hundreds of trucks on our roads and thousands of people commuting to Sydney on road or rail. But how will these growing needs and constant renewal of infrastructure be paid for? I personally am not keen on more taxes, though perhaps I could interest you all in a rate rise. Not sure. earlier this year, I had the opportunity. You're supposed to laugh, people. Come on, this is that's funny. I thought it was funny. Okay. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to attend a session on infrastructure, righting the wrongs, with speakers from Infrastructure Australia and the Infrastructure Capital Group. They were clear that government at all levels just doesn't have the funds. Infrastructure funding, they said, would come from superannuation funds, potentially, who hold a third of the nation's wealth. It was suggested that there is a need to raise private sector funding that isn't debt, and the example used was the sale of the Port of Brisbane, where super funds contributed the major component to the purchase price. During the year, I also heard from Simon Crean, from Regional Development Australia, Minister for, when he was here speaking at an RDA event. And he spoke of government funds not being the ones to build the Malden-Dumbarton rail link. That investment, he said, would come through private sector. And who would have the greatest interest in the building of the Malden-Dumbarton rail link than perhaps a new private lessee at Port Kembla? Dom's the one driving the project of the Malden-Dumbarton rail link, and we know that this is something that ADA is behind, the state and federal government also behind that. But whether state or private, whoever is at the port, I believe, has a keen interest in seeing it built. But a private lessee, I believe, would have potentially greater buying power to see it through to completion. And as I understand, the study hasn't even commenced yet. So, the other major concern I've heard within the community, sure, everybody else has. The other major concern I have within the community, or that I've heard, is in regards to the $100 million contribution from the proposed lease coming to the Illawarra. And I'm pleased to hear the Minister say that the funds will go towards a project in this area. I think it's quite rare for such a commitment to be made specifically to one area. This is a great win for us, and we need to make sure we make the most of it, which means ensuring we develop the ideas and identify the project to which this kind of funding should be dedicated. And beyond the dedicated $100 million, we hope that other projects in our broader region may benefit from the increase in economic activity, which will surely flow with private lessees seeking to maximise the return on their investment. This investment needs to drive growth, and I'm hoping that Council's Economic Development Board, alongside RDA Illawarra, can develop a strong business case for submission through Infrastructure New South Wales for the investment of those funds, whether it be infrastructure such as roads, bridges, a rail upgrade, or perhaps health or education. Those funds have the opportunity to be a great catalyst for growth in our city. We need visionary investment in our city, a project that would not have otherwise been undertaken if not for the proceeds of these funds, a project that will create much of the needed jobs in our region, and a project our children can look back on and be proud of their heritage. I know our Lord Mayor and councillors are keen to continue discussions with the state regarding the proposal to ensure the best outcome for Wollongong, the Illawarra and its residents.
Thank you, Michelle. A couple of key points there. Michelle was emphasising the role of investment and how that creates jobs. She was emphasising the role of small business in the private sector and her faith in the private sector as perhaps a better outcome in terms of completing the Outer Harbour development, which we know is going to go on for many years. So thank you. Now, our next speaker is Graham Larkham, Director of Strategic Economic Group and a local economist. Please welcome Graham.
I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, past and present. I wish to acknowledge the working people, members of this community, and indeed public sector managers that have made this port a great port and has always operated well above its weight in terms of being able to compete. And I want to greet all of you who turned out tonight. We now have the evidence of the long-term privatisation, public partnership model, and it's a failure. A complete failure because of the rundown of public assets, the cherry-picking of major public assets by private sector financial groups that have not led to net gains in terms of economic development. Who could say our electricity assets in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia are more modernised now, more sustainable than they were under public ownership? The private sector is not investing. The investments and the benefits have been overstated. Who would want to fly on a privatised Qantas plane when you've had boards fighting for each other about what share of the money they can take for each other versus a government-owned airline like Singapore Airlines? I won't ask you to answer that question tonight. But the key point I want to make is that the rationale of the benefits has always been overstated. Privatisation has not led to competition, and I raised the point about what is happening with Port Kembla and why we have got a decision to bundle it up with Port Botany, which would lead to a consolidation of a monopolised situation, not to competition. The great success of Port Kembla over the last 30 years was when it was actually corporatised under public ownership, where it could compete more with Port Botany, and the niches around the expansion of the coal handling capacity, around agricultural produce, the grain handling terminal, all came from a local initiative with strong engagement and leadership from the council, from the trade union movement, from the business community, working together to find out what these opportunities are. These type of model will not be implemented by private sector models. I want to say to you, I do not believe that the Coalition has a mandate for the leasing privatisation of Port Kembla. Otherwise, they could have brought it to us during the election campaign and we could have voted for it, or we could have voted against it. But the problem that we've got, as I see it, in relation to privatisation of Port Kembla, is that we're focused on the wrong objective. What should our goals and objective be? Our goals should be to increase the prosperity, the opportunities for people in the Illawarra. The opportunity should be to make the Illawarra more sustainable. The opportunity should be to use our infrastructure in a totally integrated way to build a new system. We do not have a plan for an infrastructure plan for the Illawarra. I've read carefully the report from Infrastructure New South Wales and the draft long-term plan from the Department of Transport, of which Wollongong hardly gets a mention. If we had a comprehensive economic development and infrastructure vision, which would say that young people could get from Dapto to Central in less than 1 hour, that say that we could properly integrate freight all across the state into Port Kembla, then I might be a convert. But at the moment, we've been sold a pup. It's basically saying, when we get the proceeds, we'll do something with it. But it's the wrong way round. I put it to the government in a constructive way, I hope, that work with the council, work with the union movements, work with the business community here, and let's start to put a total economic development and infrastructure vision together about how the whole city can work in the future to satisfy long-term goals. You're concentrating on the wrong thing by thinking about getting the budget back into surplus. I was in China last week, and the one bit of joke that my Chinese colleagues had, it was the one article we found at the New South Wales Treasury actually was in surplus. And we got our estimates wrong. We weren't in deficit, we're actually in surplus. But to me, it is a meaningless concept. It's basically, how do you use good budgetary processes to lead to good outcomes? I think we should make a strong case for public ownership of a whole number of strategic assets. And one of the things that I'm finding out now is that we're in North America, in Europe and Japan. The old models of privatisation, the private sector can do everything better, has failed. The high growth prosperity countries of the Asia-Pacific region, the state plays a central role. It owns a lot of public enterprises. It works with the private sector, so there is a new paradigm of development emerging. The Morgan Stanley getting financial advice to carve up old public assets, which are profitable in the first place, is being discredited. So I say we need to look at a case for the public ownership of Port Kembla. And the case is very simple. No one has said to me that this is an inefficient asset. No one says to me that it's a loss leader. What it is an organisation that does well because it has been very well managed over a long period of time. I think we should open up the debate about the reform of public sector, and I agree with the previous speaker about looking for funds. I think we should be looking at new ways of financing strategic assets, but I don't believe we should give up public control. I think that in relation to strategic assets, we should look at modernising our public enterprise and our public sector and get a new culture, a culture where you work for the public sector because you're driven by overriding goals and objectives to serve the people. Not about making money, getting big bonuses and so on, though for skilled people I think they should. And the final thing that I want to say is that we should look at broadening the charter of some of these community assets. The greatest experience I had down here, and this is the reason I'm passionate, is that it was the business community, the council, community representatives, the trade unions, who took on the battle of the diversification of the port when it was given up as being a port that we should run down because we were going to focus on Port Botany, the one port where we should concentrate all our assets. That was turned around by strong community leadership, and I believe that's what we should be doing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Some very clear points there about the government picking the private assets for privatisation to maximise the returns to government, that consolidation of Port Kembla and Port Botany would lead to less, not more competition, that there's no government mandate for this program, and also a question about where is the infrastructure plan for New South Wales. Now, I have a whole bunch of questions here, so we're coming to the fun part of the night where we throw it down to you on the floor. You get to jump up and ask a few questions, and then after our question and answer session, we're going to hear a little bit more from some of our special speakers that we have down the front here. Vicky's got the mic, so what I'm going to do is nominate people to ask questions, and as I call out their name, Vicky will run over and hand the microphone over and they can ask the question. Now, I'm going to use my privilege here a little bit. I'm going to sneak in the first question myself, and I'd like to ask the first question, and my first question is for Greg Pearce, and I'd like to know, is it a done deal? Has the decision been made?
Thanks, Nick. No, there's a process, and we're very transparent and open with that process. The first part of it was to have a study done to see whether there was any interest in the transaction, and we're now in the next phase of that with an expression of interest that's just closed, and we will go through a very public and open process, and we will set a reserve price. We won't be letting the transaction proceed unless there is effectively a reserve price and that it makes sense economically to do so. And of course it's subject to parliamentary scrutiny.
Okay, Helen Hamilton. Helen, are you here? I know you're here, I saw you earlier. Helen? She's outside. Okay, let's go to our next person. Daniela, how will the private sector generate local jobs? Daniela, I can't read the surname. O-H... Yili. Is Daniela here? Okay, Daniela, can you ask your question? And address it to one of the people on the panel, please.
Well, just to the Minister, I'd just like to know if whoever leases the port, will it generate local jobs, or will workers in from overseas?
Thank you. That's a really good question. It goes to the core of what we're trying to achieve here. We've had some discussion about the profitability of the port, but the reality is, whilst the port makes a profit, since 2004-5, under the previous government, the port has not paid any dividends to the government. And the reason for that, so it's not paid any dividends. The reason for that is because our port needs very significant infrastructure to be provided to get customers in. And that's why I mentioned there were several elements to what we're trying to achieve here. One, yes, was the upfront payment of the $500 or so million. But secondly, in order to get new customers and to keep the port viable, we have to keep building the outer port, the outer harbour. And that's going to cost at least $700 million. And in the medium time, we will not have that $700 million. So to get a private sector entity in to put in that money, that will create jobs. That will create jobs. And the comparison was made earlier with Newcastle. Well, the difference with Newcastle is they have these mountains of coal coming in trains, and they have to put them on boats to sell them to China and other places. There's no need for the government to invest in Newcastle. The private sector will build the next coal loader up there. Their problem is not attracting clients, it's not building the port infrastructure, it's not coming up with $700 million. Their problem is actually being able to export the stuff. So for us, if we can get a vibrant private organisation to run this port, build on it, that will create jobs. And the flow-on of creating those jobs will be reflected in all the other services that develop to service a port, a vibrant port.
Hi, Nick. I've got Helen here. Do you mind doing her question again?
Yep, Helen Hamilton. Is Helen back? Okay, you got the microphone. Excellent. Yep. Go for it, Helen.
I don't know which question. I've got several in. Which one, Nick?
Which question, Helen?
How will the public get transparency when it is a private ownership and freedom? You asked more than one question, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought it was one question, one person. But no, how will the public get transparency when it is a private ownership and freedom of information cannot be utilised? Is that it?
Yes, that's my question. Since I did a big freedom of information case earlier on. Yeah.
And who would you like to address that question to?
Anyone that wants to answer it.
Okay, I'll just repeat the question then. How will the public get transparency when it is privately owned or private ownership and freedom of information cannot be utilised? So you're saying that the public won't be able to access information about what's going on because it will be privately run?
You can only do freedom of information on government bodies, not public bodies, not private companies.
I guess that's me. Look, the lady's question is a very good one, and let's face it. Actually, I do prefer to fly on Qantas than Singapore Airlines. But like everybody else, when I fly on Qantas, if I want to know about the organisation, I get their annual reports and their accounts, because whilst they're no longer owned by a government, they are still regulated by governments. They're regulated by ASIC, the corporations controller. They're regulated through the stock exchange. And so your access to information about a privately owned port is not through freedom of information, admittedly. It's through the regulation that occurs for every business or every major business in Australia. And you will still be able to get an annual report, just as shortly I'm going to be able to give you the annual report for the port, in which I know he can't be here tonight, but Nick Whitlam writes this. The Port Kembla board supports the government's decision. We believe that a lease to private interests, not constrained by the government's fiscal position or its capital budget, is likely to result in a more rapid development of the port.
So can I ask, if there's something happening and we want to know what's going on, we've got to wait till the annual report comes out before you can find out?
No, it's the same as anything else that goes on at the port at the moment. Anyone, as I mentioned earlier, pretty much all of the activity at the port is already in private hands. And so for information about what's going to go on, if it's new capital development, new capital works, it goes through the normal approval processes, either through the council or local planning authorities, whatever. The same transparency is there for every other major business that operates now.
Okay, I think you might have to stay there, Greg. I think the next one is for you as well. Timothy Bridges, are you here? Timothy, okay. Can someone get a microphone? Actually, why don't I give you this mic? Then you don't have to get up and down.
Okay, mate, do you know what question it was that I just...
Oh, you asked more than one question too, did you? Maybe I didn't make that rule clear at the
several.
beginning of the night. One question each, please. Although people can still submit questions over at the side if you want to at this stage. But the question I have here from you is, how can we be bribed by the fact that the Illawarra roads and infrastructure will not go ahead unless the port is privatised? So I think you're asking, will infrastructure investment still occur if the port is not privatised?
Yeah, basically that's correct.
Okay.
Look, the answer is yes, of course, infrastructure will continue to be provided by governments, but, and this is the key point I was trying to make earlier, by allowing a transaction that moves into private hands, the operation of a facility like a port, which doesn't have to be run by a government, we get money up front, we free up the extra capital that we would otherwise have to invest, and we get the multiplier effect by bringing things forward, the jobs that we get by being able to build the extra port. And it's not just us saying this. As I mentioned earlier, this is a tried and true way to bring forward investment, to free up investment, to get more jobs and to get more infrastructure. And just if you doubt me, I invite you to read Infrastructure Australia's report out last month, October, Infrastructure Australia, answers to Anthony Albanese and the federal Labor government. And this report is part of the answer to removing the infrastructure deficit is to do these sorts of transactions. And you might recognise the front cover of Infrastructure Australia's report is a photograph of Port Kembla Port, which they've identified, the federal government's body has identified as an excellent example of how to do this.
Okay, I think Arthur Rorris would like to make a response to that. I'm going to allow him to do that just to give Greg a moment to have
Minister
a breath.
Pearce is quite right, but in fairness to the Federal Transport Minister, Infrastructure Australia is an independent body, and Infrastructure Australia has in fact come out and said that they wouldn't mind seeing Port Kembla privatised. It's true. But when you look at what Infrastructure Australia does, it's actually give out the public money. That means that's one place in Australia they don't have to spend as much on, because under this arrangement, it's privatised, and I think as the Minister conceded earlier, you're expecting the private sector to invest in the infrastructure in and around that port as well. And Infrastructure Australia is simply saying, well, good-o, that's one place we don't have to worry about. The question we should be asking is that the Illawarra getting our fair share of our federal taxes?
Okay, we have a nice sort of continuation of that theme, because I think the next...
Excuse me, mate, before you ask the next question, sorry to butt in, would I be able to get Graham to answer that question for me as well, the same question that I just asked previously on the infrastructure?
Sure, Graham Larkham.
Thank you.
Well, we're facing an extraordinary dilemma. Why is it that a country as prosperous as Australia spends so little as a proportion of GDP on infrastructure? 2% or less. China currently spends 14% of its GDP, and it's a poor country. I make the point to you that all of us have to take a completely new look at our whole infrastructure system and find ways, finding the funds and financing it so we can actually equip ourselves for the type of economy that we want. So this straddles, of course, the basic transport infrastructure, the community infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, the communications like the NBN infrastructure. But I don't believe that we're in the game. And while we talk about, well, we want to keep taxes low, we're not going to tax certain proportions of the population, we want to keep the budget in a surplus, we are actually missing the strategic dilemma that we've got, and that is we simply don't have the process and strategies to put in place an economy for the 21st century. If you call it the Asian century, let's learn some lessons about how it's been done successfully. And it's not this failed model, believe me. Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Dr. Robert Carr. Rob Carr, are you here? Yep.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for the opportunity to present a question in the Q&A. My question, if I remember correctly, as a historian, I'm pretty bad at remembering things, so help me if I'm out of line here, Nick. The question, I believe, was, the context for the question is this. We've heard from Councillor Blitzavs and we've heard from the Minister tonight that the $100 million is guaranteed to come to the Illawarra. This is a prime central part of their case. Now, in the legislation in the Hansard, correct me if I'm wrong, and if you could clarify, Minister, does the Hansard for the legislation for this privatisation not say that Nick Greiner and New South Wales, Infrastructure New South Wales, will have sole control of where that $100 million goes? And the second part of the question is, can you clarify how the community will have a say in that process?
Can I just assure you that the Premier, the Treasurer, the Finance Minister will be making sure the $100 million lands back here. And you don't have to ask Nick. I've just told you it's coming back here, and you don't have to worry about that. Can I just address the Chinese 14% growth? China maybe is spending 14% of its GDP on infrastructure, because if you go to China, people are still, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people are still living in poverty in rural areas. China doesn't have a AAA credit rating. China doesn't have a social security system. China doesn't have wonderful trade unions that ensure great work conditions for their employees and for their members and for other employees. China doesn't have old age pensions. I can go on. So, let's understand that we're not talking apples with apples when we talk about that. And in terms of how we will engage the community, we'll make some announcements about that. We're just not ready to do that tonight.
Michelle Blitzas would also like to say a few words to that question.
I think, from time to time these opportunities are going to come up, and that's part of the reason that Council has put in place its Economic Development Board, and I think that's part of the reason that RDA Illawarra also exists. I think that we can't just expect $100 million and then all squabble about where we think that those funds should go. I think it's highly critical that we come up with a strong plan and a strong case for where those funds should go. Should they be split up and go into smaller projects, or should they go into one larger project that we know will, create something amazing that will in turn bring jobs to the region? Should it be a road? Should it be rail? Should it be a school? Should it be a hospital? I don't know. But we have this great facility at the university, the Smart Infrastructure Centre, and I'm hoping that we can work with them. We have university representation on our advisory board. And so I know that council and the councillors are very keen, it was part of our resolution, was to work with others to present a strong case, to work with the state government to make sure that those funds are used in a way that is actually going to return investment and return a great use to the community. And certainly, if anybody has any ideas about where they should be sent, by all means, please send them through to me. I'd love to hear about them.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next question is from Bruno Conti. Bruno, are you here?
My question is directed to the Minister. It's a similar point that Arthur's made, but I'll try and put it in a different way. Now, the state government places a lot of importance on maintaining the AAA credit rating. Given that it's almost universally acknowledged that the credit rating agencies place the AAA credit rating on financial products to the USA housing sector, knowing that the products were financially worthless and borrowers didn't have the capacity to pay back those loans, and subsequently that triggered off the GFC, the global financial crisis. Now, in more recent times, and only this week, they lost the case in the Supreme Court for marketing financial products to local government authorities. And I'll tell you what the judgment said. The judgment said they misled the local authorities. They misled them about the inaccurate value of those products, and they're now required to pay back some $30 million to local councils. Given that, why are we placing such importance on these credit rating agencies when they've got such a poor track record? That's my first point.
I think that'll do, Bruno.
Sorry, Nick, just the second part of this question. It's important.
Can you keep it short?
I'll keep it short.
Yep.
Okay, it's in relation to the state budget. The state budget is in deficit due to, the claim is, your government's making the claim that the state budget's in deficit due to excess spending by the previous government. That's not true. I'll tell you why it's not true. It's not true because basically your receipts have fallen, the GST receipts have fallen because people are saving more and spending less. It's got nothing to do with excess spending by the previous government. That's the first thing. And the most important and most critical point to make is you need to look at not the absolute figure for the deficit, you need to look at the debt servicing ratio. And the debt servicing ratio is similar to the previous government. So, given that, why do we have to, as a region, cop this? 1.7 billion in education cuts, TAFE fees are up 9%, the Wollongong Corporate Square is up for sale, the ownership of the PET machine is in private hands, not public hands, child protection's been outsourced to the NGO sector, and of course now we're trying to lease off the port. And I'll tell you what this means.
Bruno, you're turning it into a lecture, mate.
Okay, I'm just...
Let's just leave it at that.
No,
okay?
Nick,
we'll get an answer.
This is what it means in terms of a personal... in terms of the personal.
Yeah, but it's not a question.
My wife... Here's the question, Nick. Here's the question. My wife is a librarian at a TAFE. She's just been told her library's about to close. That's one. My dad's currently in a hospital. He's had a stroke. I can't even get basic information because the nurses are so overworked because the public hospital system is under-resourced. I work in a state government program working with marginalised kids. I don't know if I've got a job. That's what your cuts mean to us.
Well, Bruno, you know, that's a pretty passionate sort of speech, and I appreciate you raising those issues. At the last issues there, I'm perfectly happy if you want to make contact in a direct way with my office to follow through on those issues that you mentioned in relation to your dad. Look, on the credit rating, I'm not in the business of defending rating agencies. However, there are two things to it. First of all, the international financial system is based around and relies on those ratings. And the ratings agencies, in terms of governments, have generally done a good job. Not the things that you mentioned, not those other products, but in terms of governments. So it is still a recognised measure within the financial system of how governments perform, and their ability to borrow, to raise money, depends on that rating system, the integrity of which has been maintained. And so that you can understand how that impacts, you need to go and look at countries like Greece and Spain, where they have lost their rating. Now, Greece, again, in 2 weeks' time, is faced with not having enough money to pay the wages. So don't worry about closing one library, no wages, because they don't have a rating and they can't raise the money because no one will lend it to them. So, you know, this is very serious territory, and it's very important that we continue to demonstrate our financial good management. In relation to the budget, I'm not aware of us claiming that the budget position is because of excess spending by previous governments. We have complained that the previous governments spent faster than they were getting revenues in, and we have said we won't do that. We won't do that because we have to live within our means, and that's why we've had to make other cuts and seek savings, because we are determined to live within our means. And you're right, our revenues have significantly plummeted, and so we're not going to raid the piggy bank, we're not going to get an extra 5 credit cards, we're going to live within our means.
Okay, now we have a pile more questions to get through here. Sorry, Bruno. Sorry. Yeah. Bruno, all these people want to ask questions too, so we're not going to get through them all, so let's just get through as many as we possibly can. And the next question is from Donna Abati. Donna Abati?
Thank you for coming tonight and organising this. My question's a bit of a left field one. I'm involved in a heritage organisation which is actually located in the port area, and I'm concerned about what will the guarantee is, if there is a guarantee to keep the look after the heritage items that are actually currently being managed by the Port Corporation itself, such as the Koori Middens, a World War II fortress, and also a steam crane, which is located on the site as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. We have Dom Figliamini here, the CEO of the Port Kembla Port Corporation, and I think he's the best person to address that question. If you could come up, Dom, that'd be great.
In relation to the heritage assets of the port, which have been maintained by the port over a number of years, and people who have gone there have seen some significant improvement over the last 12 or so months, the requirement is that whoever, if the port is leased, that the responsibility and the maintenance of the heritage centre will continue the way it is now. There is no expectation that any of that will change. The facilities need to be managed in accordance with any heritage plan and any heritage requirements. So the expectation is that that will continue regardless under whatever ownership it may be. And that is actually something that will be formalised as part of the transaction document.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. The next question is from Timothy Bridges. Timothy Bridges? You've already had one. But he has a specific question. I quite like this one. It's what's going to happen to seafarers. So it's a bit similar to that question in that sense that it's about an organisation that is connected to the port. And so the question is, what will happen? Yeah, ask it.
Question. That's a specific question for the Minister. And what will happen generally with the seafarers and the wharfies and most of the other jobs down at the ports? Because as we all know, the ports don't just provide jobs for us in the main area, but also for the farmers, for everybody else that's linked to the transport industry, and as well as the community in Illawarra with the hospitals, the schooling, and all the rest of it. I just wanted to know, what will happen?
Thank you, and Vicky, sorry to... I should just say thank you to Councillor Vicky Curran and a couple of the other councillors here, Councillor Colaccino and Councillor Krasnich, and I know others who've been working hard on tonight's event, so thank you very much for doing that. In terms of the employees, I think, the answer is sort of threefold. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of people who work in the port already work for the private enterprise. The vast majority of people who work in the port work for private enterprise. They have their jobs through private enterprise. In relation to a number of the services, the safety and various other services, the pilots and so on, they will be retained under the Port Corporation, so they're essential services to keep the port running. And if we get a private sector operator in there which is going to grow it, obviously we've got to keep those services going. In relation to, I think, about 25 jobs, as I again indicated earlier, in accordance with other transactions, those people will be offered employment with the new private sector or they'll have 2 years job security. So it'll work through in the way that it has on other transactions, but the intention is to grow the port, grow jobs.
Our next question is from Kieran Crumlin. We've probably got time for about 2 more. Kieran Crumlin.
I work for Sydney Ports Corporation. I drive a pilot boat up there, and I know this is primarily about Kembla, but effectively my question I think is broad-based enough to cover both ports, and that is, my understanding is we're losing most of our revenue stream once to the private sector, basically once both ports are sold. I don't have a great deal of confidence that the shooters will be holding the process up, to tell you the truth. You know, odds are it's going to go ahead. I think everybody concedes that. Once that revenue stream's gone, the primary function of the port is safe shipping, getting those ships in and out of that harbour, and protection of the marine environment. We're going to have a shortfall of funding, certainly in the ports of Sydney and Botany, I suspect in the ports of Kembla as well. Now, do you have a commitment to the environmental protection of both ports in terms of what we currently provide? And given that there is likely to be a shortfall of funding, being the Finance Minister, is there a guarantee of where that funding will come from?
Sorry, was that Kieran?
Kieran,
yeah. Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Again, I think I touched on this a couple of times earlier. To keep the ports vibrant, to make them grow, we as a government will continue to perform and to provide the regulatory sort of services that are required. And I think that includes the pilots, doesn't it, Don? Yeah. So it includes the pilots, it includes emergency services and so on. How they will be funded going forward will be a matter for us as a government to work out in our normal budgeting processes. But yes, you have that guarantee. And when you think about it, there's no point us bringing a private operator in and saying, oh, sorry, there are no port services, there's no safety services. Those are essentials, and whoever comes in as an operator will be just as insistent as you are that those services are provided.
Okay, so we've got about another 12 minutes or so before the Minister has to go, and he wants to, Greg Pearce wants to do a quick wrap up before he goes. So what I'm going to do is get a response from Arthur Rorris to that question, and then I'm going to do one more, and if we have time we'll do 2 more. So Arthur.
This question goes to the heart of the privatisation issue, because if you think about it, and I think it's a great decision to have the emergency services in public hands, but what that belies is the flaw in the logic in privatisation. By that we mean the risk. You keep that risk. It's too big a risk to be put into the private hands. You want to keep it in public hands. This is the point here. You keep the risks. But if you keep the risks, what are we doing? Just outsourcing the profits? Why would you do that? If you're keeping the risks, let's keep the profits too.
Okay, our next question is from Gary Keane. Is Gary Keane here? Can someone hand Gary a microphone?
Thanks, mate. Once again, I put a couple of questions in. I'm not sure which one this relates to, but I've got being intrinsically involved in the running of the port through the Maritime Union, there's a couple of issues I'd just like to take with what the Minister said. Whilst the loading and the unloading of the vessels is controlled by private sector, when that ship pulls up to that berth, the berth is owned by the state. The revenue that comes from it pulling up to that berth, it goes to the state. That's how part of what you make your money out of. The other part is where you're saying that the private sector that runs a berth controls the stevedores and the seafarers and so forth. Those seafarers, particularly the waterside workers that are down there at the moment, have been given a bit of a kick, and as you mentioned earlier about the blue scope structure getting out of export. It's been a big impact on us. Our shining light for the future is the expansion of the port, and it goes to the second question I think I've got down there, Nick, is what is stuck into the tendering process that guarantees that the expansion of the Port Kembla Harbour is not going to be tied to waiting until Port Botany Harbour hits capacity under this process and has to then have an alternate area for the containers to come into. I don't see how there's not an ACCC sort of a scenario with this. If the expansion of the port harbour in Port Kembla is slowed up, it has a direct impact on the seafarers, it has a direct impact on the waterside workers that are reliant on the expansion of that port for the future of this area going forward and for the money that brings into the area. The peripheral, the industry that also creates.
All right, can we get to the question?
Well, the question is basically what in the tendering process ties it into the expansion of the outer harbour going forward in a reasonable rate, not relying on what happens in Sydney as the capacity hits for container terminals.
Look, I think you again, hit one of the key issues here. You're reliant on the continued work on the expansion of the port through the outer harbour works. As I mentioned to you earlier, that's currently estimated to be worth about $700 million, maybe more, and there isn't any money in the budget to do it. So, fair comment. Of the so-called billion, 700 million of it is advance money paid by the federal government to ensure that they get a surplus this year, and it's roads money and it's already allocated to roads, so we can't use it. But look, our judgment is if we can get the private sector to come in and to fund that extra work, then it'll happen a lot faster than in the forward expectation that we'll have in terms of what we can fund as government. And again, the point I made earlier, unlike Newcastle, where they've got trains sort of just lining up to come in with coal to go off to China and everywhere else, the port here has to find the businesses, and they've done a fantastic job. Dom and your team have done and all of you who work there, and people there, fantastic job of finding the businesses, bringing them in over the last decade or two. But we've been a bit lucky. The cars, let's face it, that was a political decision to move the cars here. The coal exports at the moment, we've been a bit lucky that we've had a couple of good companies that have put the money in and are running the mines at the moment and exporting. So it's not by any means a done deal that expansion would happen without the private sector.
All right, thank you. Now, I think we've got time for
Can I just follow up on that? Because there was a couple of things there that I just want to raise, and it's been raised several times. The expansion of the outer harbours, talking about $700 million, was always planned to be a staged expansion. It was going to go in stages, and the costing was going to go incrementally along with those stages. There is currently a second coal terminal or expanded coal terminal being built by the private sector in Port Kembla, so it's not luck. If it's good in Newcastle, it works all right, but if it's down here, it was lucky. That's being done by the private sector now. There's no need to lease the port out to have some of that expansion done. We don't need $700 million tomorrow to continue the expansion of the port.
Did you want to respond to that, or have you already answered the question? All right. The Minister said he's already answered the question, so that means we've got time for one last question, and then Greg Pearce will wrap up, and then we'll move on to the next part of the night where we have a number of other people who get up and speak briefly on their position. So the last question is coming from Michael Mastroni? Michael? Okay, Michael. Try and keep it short, please, Michael.
Yep, thanks. My question relates again to this competition issue. Back in 1989, when the port was first established, it was based on a report commissioned by the then Minister Baird, who was Minister for Transport, which recommended 3 ports for competition. And the Joy report, as it was called, Dr. Joy wrote the report. And it seems to me that the potential for Sydney and Port Kembla to be locked together actually is undoing the good stuff that's happened over the last 23 years. So my question, Minister, is why can we not have a privatisation that is Port Kembla separate from Botany and not have the potential for the two to be locked together if we're going to have a privatisation at all?
Okay, I'll get the Minister to answer that and also make his final comments at the same time, if that's okay.
Look, thank you for that question. I know you did a great job with the port, and partly your work is why it's working so well at the moment. I guess that the simple answer, as I understand it, is that first of all, the process we're going through simply leaves it open for interested parties to put forward their proposal either with one or either or both. So I guess at the end of the day, the answer will be the market will show whether it stacks up or not as a single or as two together. But the other thing is that since Bruce Baird, the current Treasurer's father, was the Minister, we've had nearly 2 decades go by. And in that period, there's been an enormous amount of work done, particularly in relation to the transport system, with the intermodals at Moorebank and the other one, Enfield, wherever it is. There's been construction of the rail freight lines through the back of Sydney, and just the whole way that ports operate, particularly the containers and the growth of containers has changed. So whilst that report was probably pretty good 20 years ago, the best advice we can get at the moment is to go forward with the options and let the market come forward, and we can test it that way. Can I just finish then by acknowledging that certainly by the applause level, I think the room is moving one way, and it's great that you've been prepared to come along and make sure we know your views and the issues you've got. By the way that the flow of questions came, I think that you can tell that certainly we've heard and understood the issues, and we will be very conscious of those as this process goes forward. Can I recommend to you that you watch and read the material as it comes out? It will be a transparent process, and Parliament will scrutinise it. And you have... I didn't... No, well, as I said, I'm very grateful for so many of you who've come along to say, put your views. No. Well... Thank you. And I'm sure if you'd like to make a longer statement, that Nick would be happy for you to do so.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there, and I'd like everybody to put their hands together and thank Greg Pearce, the Minister for the Illawarra and the Minister for Finance, for taking time out of his busy schedule to come down and address this public meeting. Thank you very much for coming. Now we're going to continue with some other speakers. You can go if you like, or you can. Yeah. Okay. Oh well, all right. Well, we'll thank the rest of our panel as well while we're at it, because we're going to have some other speakers that are going to come up onto the stage. So could we also thank Michelle Blitzas, Wollongong City Councillor, Arthur Rorris from the South Coast Labor Council, and local economist Graham Larkham. Thank you very much. Put your hands together for them. But don't leave unless you have to. There's still more to come. Okay, now we have a couple of other speakers. And first of all, we've got 3 minutes down here, which isn't very long, but we'll see how we go. So first of all, we've heard from the Liberal Party. I'd like to welcome onto the stage Ron Honig, the MP for Heffron, the Shadow Minister for Energy, Shadow Minister for Ports. Could you come up and say a few words? The timer goes back on, sorry.
I recognise the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. My parliamentary colleagues, my Lord Mayor, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. New South Wales is $1 million business. It is not a school tuck shop. Those are the words last week from the New South Wales Auditor General when he found $1 billion in the Treasury because the Treasurer couldn't add up. Today, he found $100 million worth of extra dividends or electricity tax in respect to the money collected by lifting electricity charges on the people of New South Wales. Yet these are the people whom are going to judge whether or not there is value for money in the sale of the port. I mean, have you in your life ever heard of a treasurer and a treasury not being able to add up? When Parliament resumes next week, I'm going to present the treasurer with an abacus, and I've offered today to show him how to use it. Scrutiny of the legislation by Parliament. They tried to rush the bill through in a day. They gave me and the Shadow Treasurer the bill at 9:30 in the morning and said you can have a half an hour briefing at 10 o'clock, and then tried to rush it through the Parliament. And they got the bill through in a day. I think maybe Michael Daly filibustered and it took till the next day. And it's stuck in the upper house, otherwise it would be through. Now, can I tell you this? Every ship that comes into Wollongong provides $1 million to the Illawarra community. In 1 year, $1 billion worth of economic activity has been generated in the Illawarra by the port. The port is said to be worth about $500 million. And it generates about $50 million a year in revenue. Can you ask yourself this question? What business would sell an asset or capitalise an asset that is worth $500 million and invest it in a liability? Because when you're a private company and you sell an asset, say, that's worth $500 million, you take the money and you buy another asset that generates you more income, or you retire debt. You don't invest it in something that costs you money, otherwise you go broke. When you're the government, when they say they're going to invest the capital into a road, a road's a liability. It's not a profit-making venture. It is really basic economics and it's basic bookkeeping. Now, one of the things that we really need to understand in this process is why it is important for a facility like Port Kembla or Port Botany, for that matter, to be in public ownership. The economic rationalists will tell you, the Margaret Thatcherites will tell you, if there is one thing worse than a public monopoly, it is a private monopoly. And that's what the government seeks to do by the sale of the port, create a monopoly. Secondly, it is extremely important that the government can run very important access to the nation's facilities that provide for both import and export. Because there are times when governments have to make decisions which are not simply based upon the private sector and markets. For example, the decision, for the cars to be imported and exported out of Port Kembla was a political decision based upon providing an economic need to the Illawarra. Without governments in control of these things, how else are regional areas to be looked after? And there is something else you need to know. Don't be $1 million out that's going into the Illawarra, because this morning I can tell you on the ABC, Duncan Gay, the Roads Minister, announced $1.5 billion has been committed to the Pacific Highway out of the sale of Port Botany and Port Kembla. So if you think you're going to get $100 million towards some of your projects in this particular area, you've been shortchanged big time. This is a government, I can tell you, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? Is it because they have this philosophy? I can tell you why they're doing it. What they're doing is they're selling off the state assets so they can pay off state debt, so they can borrow money for their WestConnex proposal and their North West Rail link, so that they can maintain their AAA credit rating, so they can be seen to be doing something to get them past the next 2 elections. And I'm afraid the people of Illawarra are going to pay the price for it. Thank you.
Okay, Ron, thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I think we should also point out that Paul Green, the Christian Democrat MLC from the Upper House, was invited along tonight. And he is a crucial figure because essentially the crossbenchers will decide whether this legislation goes through or not. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, and I know he's been in talks with the government about whether he's going to support it or not. But somebody who is here from the Upper House is Dr. John Kay. He's from the New South Wales Greens, and I'm sure he can bring you his perspective from the Upper House, New South Wales Upper House. So welcome, Dr. John Kay.
I too acknowledge that we're meeting today on the land of the Aboriginal people, the traditional owners, and this is Aboriginal land, always has been and always will be. We are privileged to be here. We should treat it as a privilege and not as a right. So this is it, Barronomics. Barrynomics. Some people call it neoliberalism, some people call it rationalism. I call it economic voodooism. It's irresponsibility on a grand scale. What it says you do is you take an income-bearing asset and you sell it off. And you sell it off to a private owner who's going to operate it for one purpose and one purpose only, to maximise their profit. And what do? You cash it in, you get a bag of cash. Just before the next election, you announce a whole lot of really popular projects, and you say you got the cash to build them, and you get re-elected. It's based on the concept the people of New South Wales are mugs. Well, it's my experience after 5 years in the Upper House, they are not mugs at all. They fully understand that if you get $500 million for an asset that earns a profit of $50 million a year, that after 10 years you're worse off. They fully understand, much worse than that the legislation that the O'Farrell government is putting through the Upper House not only allows the sale of the ports, but it allows that tried and true shibboleth of the Conservatives. What it allows the Treasurer Mike Baird to do is restructure the ports industry so that he can privatise the profit-making bits, and he can keep all the expensive, all of the risky, all of the dangerous bits, all of the liabilities in public hands. So you privatise the profits and you keep the expensive and dangerous bits in public hands. Minister Pearce says, oh, that's great. We'll look after that. We'll have the public activities looking after the stuff like emergency services. We'll have the public looking after the environment. We'll have the public sector cleaning up after the spills. We'll have the public sector taking responsibility if something goes wrong at the port. And we've seen this before. Labor's GenTrader transaction did exactly that. And right now we're paying hundreds of millions of dollars to Origin Energy because Ararang has a fire in one of its transformers. This is not good economics, this is lousy economics. But it's not just the people of New South Wales who are being ripped off, it's the people of the Illawarra who are being savagely ripped off. This port is your connection to the global economy. And make no mistake, a private operator is not a charitable institution. When the boardrooms of the companies that will own the Illawarra come to make decisions, Port Kembla come to make decisions, they won't be thinking, what's good for you, what's good, what will create jobs in the Illawarra. They'll be thinking, how do we maximise our short-term return? It's not just short-term, it's selfish. This is a port that was built by public sector workers. It was paid for by the people of New South Wales. It's been managed by public sector managers for the people of New South Wales on behalf of the people of New South Wales. The absolute reality is that when Minister Pearce says we have a problem with revenue, that might be true. But I ask Minister Pearce this. If he had a shortfall, he had a rough patch, maybe had some gambling debts, has a rough patch, would he sell his house in order to keep his operations going? What kind of business sells assets to pay recurrent costs? That is truly voodoo economics, because in the end it means we end up as a much poorer state, we end up as a beggar state in a very rough and nasty world. But there's another way of doing this. There's a Greens way of doing this, and it's based on this. This is a public sector, a public asset operated by the public sector. There's a reason why when you throw the switch, the lights go on. There's a reason why when you turn the tap, the water comes out. There's a reason why there are trains and roads and hospitals. It's because governments recognise that the collective borrowing capacity of all us together is far greater and far more secure than any corporation could ever be. And what that means is that the public sector can borrow at a real rate of interest of about 2%. Off an asset that earns $50 million a year, you can comfortably and safely borrow $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion to keeping public ownership, $2.5 billion to reinvest in the port, $2.5 billion to solve the transport bottlenecks in the Illawarra, $2.5 billion to secure the hospitals, the schools. What you have to do is turn around and say to the rating agencies, go. You have to turn around to the spivs and the men in the sharp suits who are circling New South Wales to pick up fire sale assets. You are not welcome in this state. This state belongs to the people of New South Wales. That port belongs to the people of the Illawarra. It should remain in our hands. It should be there to serve us, not the rating agencies and not the corporate spivs. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. And thank you for the signage at the front there. Now we're going to have one last speaker, and then we're going to wrap it up, and we're going to have a local Labor MP, and it's going to be Noreen Hay, the member for Wollongong. Welcome up, Noreen Hay.
Thank you, and thanks, Nick, and acknowledge parliamentary colleagues, local dignitaries, Labor Council Secretary and councillors. Well, a couple of things I'd like to say before I start. It's all been very civilised tonight, hasn't it? I've obviously come from a different kind of background. It's far more civilised than some of the forums I've attended in the past, but nonetheless, it's a good thing. if you actually get some facts and some reality. I got here in time and managed to change my flight from Melbourne so I could get here in time to listen to Greg Pearce. And one of the things that I found he did here tonight, which is what he does in Parliament, and what they all do in Parliament, which is any good solid question, is just completely fobbed over with niceties. It's all very nice. It's all economic rationale and necessities, and look, you know, we don't have money and we don't have... $1 billion. Now, you know, whilst we can laugh, it's not funny that they didn't know they had $1 billion. Let me tell you, and Michelle, for your benefit too, this government got a AAA rating, credit rating, from the former Labor government. They got it having constantly criticised the former Labor government for mismanaging, for not being able to look after revenue, and they went into government with a surplus. So what did they do? They announced to the world that they went in and found themselves with a big black hole of $70 million. Now, perhaps had they found that billion, they might have found the surplus that they went into that they were denying. So here's my position. I won't go over the economic arguments again because clearly people have done that and done that very well. But this is a New South Wales government who one of their first actions was to lay off all what they considered surplus employees. These are the very same protected employees they're now talking about offering protected employment and retaining employment to any surplus employees in the privatisation of our port, which should tell you that 5 minutes they'll last before they lay them off with the rest. If it's such a good idea and it was so economically sound, why did this current government during the election campaign publicly state to our local media they had no intentions of privatising the port? Why didn't they say, yes, we're going to do it, it's going to be better for all of you? And I don't take away from Dom and the great work that the Port Corp has done. In fact, until this government, I went around promoting you all the time, Dom. I'll still promote you, but there is no excuse for what they're doing. And there is no excuse to put jobs at risk, investment at risk. And this government has basically, well, I won't go into the other things that they've attacked, but I'd like to congratulate a couple of people on keeping this fight going. I'd like to congratulate the Save Our Port Committee, right? And I'd like to congratulate them for a very difficult experience in coming to Parliament when we were quite, by accident, debating a motion that I had put up opposing the sale of the port in 2011. You might recall during the election when I said that they would privatise if they got in. I was accused of fear-mongering and scare tactics and all the rest. It's hard being proved right all the time, but there you go. There is no justification in my view. I am the local representative elected to state parliament for this area and the port is in my electorate. I have opposed it from, under our own government, quite frankly, I would have opposed it just as hard. And this government to stand here and have the minister tell you it's not a done deal when they've already put it through the lower house of parliament. The only reason it's not a done deal is if the upper house puts a stop to it. That's the only thing. And whilst they're all talking about New South Wales, and of course I'm interested in New South Wales, I'm a member of the New South Wales Parliament, but I'm interested in the Illawarra first. And if you define what is the Illawarra for $100 million, what is, do you know what $100 million will get you? Nothing. And they insult our intelligence by thinking we don't realise that out of 500 million they're taking away 400. Right? Then they find $1 billion they didn't know they had. So my meagre maths is 1 billion, 500 mil, you don't sell it, you've still got 500 mil you didn't know you had. Is that right or wrong? So, this government has shown its bona fides, they cannot be trusted. And whilst I do trust those running the port, I don't trust this government, and to have Greg Pearce stand here and say how committed to the Illawarra he is. Everything he mentioned, Bar the hospital, which was the $83 million we budgeted for, that is the former Labor government, I'll give them the credit for some of the good things they did. Every other thing he mentioned, Jamberoo, Princess Highway, all in the Liberal electorates. Gareth Ward, I don't begrudge you anything, but I begrudge you the sale of my port. And I don't begrudge the people of Flinders anything, but they're getting a new railway station, new lifts and new everything, while Unanderra can't get its lifts. And just one last second, I have got a couple of things to say because I am the local MP.
I'll give you one more minute.
Announced the car imports through the port of Port Kembla in 2004. Greg Pearce stood here tonight and said there's been no returns from the port since 2004. Well, the port was struggling, I think we'd all agree, until the political decision to put the car imports through. Prior to the 2007 election, I can give them all a history lesson. Prior to the 2007 election, the Liberal coalition said if they won the 2007 election, there'd be no car imports coming through Port Kembla. That showed their intentions way back when. Right, they have no commitment to this area, unless, of course, it's a Liberal electorate. And another thing, just on the Nick Greiner infrastructure group, you might note that the so-called commitment to Morden Dumbarton, where does that lie on the infrastructure list? And if anyone thinks for 1 second that any investor in the port is going to cover the cost of the Morden Dumbarton, you have got a wake-up call coming. So, according to Nick Greiner, we don't even have to look at that until much later on in the piece, probably never remembering that it was him who closed it down in the first place. So all I can say to you is, I have the 10,000 signature petition out there. We are almost at the 10,000 signatures for the government who... Thank you. For the government who suggests there be no more than 200 people give a hoot about that port being privatised. News for them. I obviously support the Labor Council and I obviously support the MUA and other unions. Any guarantee to those seafarers who decide to stay with the government isn't worth the time it takes to say it, right? Because where are they going to put them? And if they don't go, then it'll be redundancy and they'll be like the rest. They're all going to be laid off because we can't carry this kind of risk. So keep up the opposition, keep your signatures coming in. Hopefully I'll have the 10,000 to present in Parliament next week. And congratulations to you all. Thank you.
Okay, that's pretty much a wrap. Sorry, I'm a bit of a slave to time. I like to keep things timely, so we're running pretty much on time. But I'd like to thank Noreen Hay, the member for Wollongong, Ron Honig, the Shadow Minister for Energy and Ports, and also John Kay from the Greens for having their say there. And I'd also like to thank, acknowledge Anna Watson, the member for Shellharbour, who I didn't acknowledge earlier on. So hello and welcome, and thanks for coming, Anna. And a special thanks, if you could all put your hands together and thank, in particular, Vicky Curran, who is the chair of the Wollongong City Council Port Kembla Working Committee. And I believe the other councillors who are on that committee are Anne Martin, Bede Krasnich, Greg Petty. Have I missed anybody? And Jill Merrin. So they are the councillors who have worked to put this all together, and I know it's taken a lot of organising, a lot of hours, and they've put a lot of effort into it. So if you could give them another round of applause, that would be fantastic. And finally, thank you all for coming and participating in this wonderful public forum. Let's see if we can do it again sometime soon.